Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Flicker and Flow. I am Jaimo Benedetti. I'm a video artist from São Paulo, Brazil, and I was been researching in press cinema since 10 years ago. And then in the starting of this year, this strange year, I realized that I had to study more and then decided to create Flicker and Flow, a series of interviews with experts, researchers, curators from related to press cinema, or better saying, the archaeology of moving image. The idea of this project is to investigate, listen, and learn with these researchers. And it's a great pleasure to start this project today with a person that I have been in touch from 5 years, who is Stephen Herbert. So Stephen Herbert will be interviewed today. We are going to have a long conversation here, and I hope you like it. So Stephen Herbert is Visiting Research Fellow at Kingston University. He is specialized in research concerning early cinema and Victorian optical entertainment. He's writer, editor, and publisher of The Projection Box. He manages several websites such as The Complete Muybridge, The Wheel of Life, and the latest Optilogue. He's one of the editors of Encyclopedia of Magic Lantern. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Stephen Herbert. Stephen, thank you very much to join us here in Flicker and Flow.
It's my pleasure, Ramo. It's always good to talk with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Stephen, I think I have the idea that you present yourself like an independent researcher, since you don't have a career in an academic institution.
That's right.
So, but I can imagine that before become a independent researcher, you used to be a lover of optical devices, and etc. So when you realize that you are not a lover anymore and start to be a researcher,
I suppose there was a visit that I made to the Barnes Museum of Cinematography in St Ives, which is a very small private museum. The collection was owned by John and Bill Barnes, and they made it open to the public in, I think, 1963. And I first visited in 1971 when I was about 19, 20 maybe. And it was hugely influential. And although I had quite an extensive interest before, as you say, that was the first time I thought I want to actually seek out more information about these things. For instance, in one of the cabinets was one of Muybridge's books, and I was trying to work out what's that about, you know, I just didn't know. And I knew something about, I was a projectionist at the National Film Theatre at that time, and I knew something about film projection. I knew something about magic lanterns, but it was clear to me that there were many areas that I didn't know about. And that's when I started to go more to libraries, and then within a few years to the British Library, the Science Museum Library, and then various archives.
Yeah, that's great. And you also work as a technician, no? In MOMI in South Bank.
Yeah, I was a technician in education for many years. I was a projectionist for a couple of years when I was very young. And I was very lucky. I landed a job in a really downtrodden cinema, a very old, creaky old cinema, which meant the projectors were always going wrong. I was 17. And that meant you had to fix them. You couldn't wait for an engineer. You had to fix the things, yeah? So I learned a lot from these old machines. And so I was a technician, and then I got a job and I worked for 2 years at the National Film Theatre, the most prestigious, one of the most prestigious in the world. Every format of film, pretty much, every film from every part of history, every country, on daily change of program, several type programs a day, 2 theatres. So I was incredibly lucky at that. Those 2 years, 1970 to 72, was my university education, really, you know. And so I was a technician. Then I went into education, and I was an audiovisual technician in education, and eventually spent 10 years as a film technician at Goldsmiths College, supervising the technical aspects of student films. That's before I went back to the BFI, where I ended up, after a couple of years more there, I was head of technical services. That was for the National Film Theatre, and for the new, as it was then, Museum of the Moving Image. And I was there altogether full-time for about 7 years, and then as a consultant for the next 4 years, and then I went on to do other things.
Yes, and I suppose that. Sorry, you have an echo?
I don't have an echo.
You don't?
You don't.
Okay.
Okay.
So, your experience with the technician issues, and
Yes.
also your approximation with the optical device, makes a kind of very good combination, no? When
Yes.
you start researching. So when do you start make real publications or writing or going to Congress?
Yeah, I wrote some things for, there was a magazine about amateur filmmaking called Movie Maker, on, you know, a newsstand magazine. I knew the editors. I wrote some pieces about collecting early cinema equipment, and about filmmaking in general. And then they were sort of journalist pieces. And I started writing for little collectors magazines. And then in the late 80s, I wrote a piece for the History of Photography journal, an American journal. And that was a prestigious journal. And I wrote a piece about animated portraits, photographically animated portraits from the very early days of moving images. And
sorry, the year. Sorry to interrupt you.
Right.
Sorry, the year that you wrote this
I think
article.
it was 89.
89. Okay.
Yeah, and that was the first. I think I'd made a book review or two for professional press, but that was the first in a specific, very specialized field. It was the journal about the history of photography, so I was very pleased to have that published. And quite soon, in fact, before that, I was writing for the Magic Lantern Society journal, including an article about early German toy cinematographs and one or two other pieces. So it was the 80s, from the mid-80s onwards, that I was producing material that I can look back on now and not be ashamed of, you know.
Yes, but
Yeah.
in these years, in the beginning of the 80s, I suppose that there was nothing. There was the quality, the quantity of material in the field of optical devices and archaeology of moving image was quite in birth.
Yeah, it was limited because there were not many publications that would accept articles. And it was also the case that without the net, of course, research took a very long time. So you could spend a year doing research on an article that now you could probably do in a week. So, you know, if you had to travel to a library or an archive and come back and go back and check your work and then find the books you needed and go to another library to check the books, and, you know, it just took a long time. So it took a long time for everyone. So there were fewer publications and less material. And also one of the other problems in the 70s was there was a lot of material relating to semiology being published in the journals, the professional and the academic journals. And that was all very interesting, but it kind of squeezed out conventional historical research. And if you can't get these things published, you don't write them. And if you don't write them, you haven't done the research. So there was a period in the 70s when there was a disincentive, I think, professionally to write conventional historical articles.
Yes, understand. We have in the kind of history of the study of not only from early cinema and the press cinema, the Congress of FIAF.
Yeah.
How is the spelling in English? Sorry about that.
FIAF, we say FIAF.
FIAF, the 34th FIAF, and it's a kind of landmark in the studies of the early cinema. I will share here a website.
Yeah.
Oh, here, yes.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh gosh.
From UCLA University. It was in 1978. You have this photo here. I can just recognize Tom Gunning, of course.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Because his particular appearance, no?
Yeah.
It's very, very good image, this one. And here in this description, certainly the symposium. Yes, certainly the symposium, which gathered together numerous of young film scholars and international archivists, changed forever the way we look at early cinema.
Yeah, I think that's right in retrospect, yeah. I was there for one day.
You were there for one day?
Yeah, my friend David Wyatt, who was a BBC film editor and a film collector, excuse me, and in fact we'd run a film magazine, amateur film magazine together. He decided we should go, and we went down there, and we obviously very much enjoyed the screenings. We didn't really know who anyone was. We were amateurs, yeah. We had nothing published in the field of any consequence. We had published an interview, a talk that Audrey Wadowska had given. She was the daughter of Arthur Melbourne Cooper, who was an important early animator filmmaker around 1900, and we knew her well, and she was actually there at the conference, and we had lunch and good talk with her. But it was in the screenings, what was really interesting. I'm so crazy that I didn't go for more than one day, but of course we didn't realize it was historic. And in the screenings, it was hearing the comments of the people who did know what they were looking at, you know, the experts.
During the presentation.
Yeah, and during the screenings and after the screenings, I remember at one point there was a film came up, and there were just little typewritten titles or something, and it said George Smith, early filmmaker, and John Barnes was sitting there, historian, very respected historian. His book had been published on the beginnings of cinema in England, and he said, "That's a mill chimney in that picture, in that film. That's not the south coast. That's up north of England." And they were all discussing the attribution for the filmmaker and the locations. And of course, there'd been no opportunity really to see these films previously, and certainly not in a context where you were with all these people who, as I say, they did know what they were looking at. We didn't. And so that was wonderful. Also, there's something that I don't think I've seen reference to. There was an equipment exhibition of early film equipment on the same conference. And that was interesting to me because apart from the Barnes Museum that I knew, I'd been to several times by then, there was nothing on display in Britain because the Science Museum didn't have anything in that nature on display until 79, I think, when they had a really good exhibition of photography and early film equipment. But prior to that, the equipment, we'd only seen it in books mostly. So that was also something that was important to those interested in the technical aspects. But of course, the screenings were what mattered. And it was just, I'm just so pleased that we did take the trouble to at least go down there so I can say I was there, you know. And I remember John and Bill Barnes, I kind of knew them to nod to, and also Dennis Gifford, who compiled the British Film Catalogue. Huge work, fantastic work. Yeah. And I knew him slightly because he was also very active in cartooning and comic strip history. He was the premier authority on British comic books, and I knew him from various events. And I remember him saying to John Barnes, we could have this. We could form a commune in Cornwall, and we could do films and comics. And John was saying, I don't know anything about comics. And Dennis said, no, I'll do the comics. You can do the film. And so there were people, and it was nonsense, of course. It was just messing around. But it was great to hear this who definitely were the previous generation, two generations almost with John and Bill. So it was great to hear these people expressing their interest, and it was at that stage, I think, that I felt that I'm stuck with this now. This wasn't just another thing, I've got to, I was interested in all sorts of things, but I thought, yeah, and I was kind of stuck with that. I had, back in 72 or 3, I started collecting silent movies in 1970, and I started to correspond with someone in Argentina, Henri Bouchard. There was a Circular Cultural del Cinema, and he had original early prints of, say, Pathé films mostly, and he would make 8mm copies, and I was buying these and looking at them because there was no other way to see films. These what were still called the primitives. How else could you see them? You'd read about something in one of the old books. You could not see these. Television didn't show the films. The National Film Theatre occasionally might have a show with stream, but they had 400 different shows a year. So basically, you had to buy them, and we could only afford to buy 8mm prints. But it was the way we bought Méliès films. We bought films from America from a company called Black Hawk. They had quite a good catalogue, lots of early stuff. So we were building up collections, and by 78, when I went to that conference, I'd actually 3 years earlier, I'd actually formed a film collectors society, and we were having film conventions where people got together in London, 70, 100, 200 people, to discuss these films that we were able to acquire, new copies of old films. So by then I was pretty much stuck in it. Yeah.
That's great. Just to end the idea of Fiat Congress, yeah. Can you explain from people who are watching what happened there in this Congress in 1978 and why it was important and who were there?
The thing is, I don't know. I wouldn't have known. I didn't know these people. It was the first time I'd actually seen these scholars. Chitty de Vries from Holland was there. I know. We talked to him. He's still around, I think, and he had a book published about Arthur Milburn Cooper. And there were one or two other people, as I say, the Barnes brothers. John Barnes had written his first volume of his book, Dennis Gifford. But apart from that, I think possibly David Cleveland of the East Anglia Film Archive. I'm not sure. Yeah. But it's a long time ago. What I mostly remember is just the fun of having lunch with a lot of these people, and then along the seafront in the deck chairs with our Pepsis, chatting, going to the exhibition, and just having fun that day. And it was another film fun day, of which we tried to attend, usually amateur led. This was different in that it was the professionals. And these were people who we didn't know, and so we were I was 26 or something, and still just everything was a discovery. So that's, if I tell you any more than that, I'll be making it up.
Okay. We have a question here from Rafael Luna. Stephen, in Brazil, there is still more press cinema objects in private collections than in museums. Thank you, Rafael. Do you think it is still the same in other countries, or has it changed in the last years?
Well, I don't think there's a blanket answer for that. It's a very good question. And one of the things is that probably in many cases, too much of what's in museums is in cupboards in museums. It's in storage rooms. Totally understand why. Very expensive to set up galleries. There's a lot of competition for the space. But it's difficult to say. I think it varies from country to country. But you obviously have countries where it's considered to be more important. I mean, there's a lot of material on display in Germany. There's a lot on display at the French Cinema Museum in Paris. There is starting to be other places. I was involved in a very small private museum in Dubai, and that I think is still open, very small, open by appointment, but it was open to the public, and that was a private collection, pre-cinema to the beginnings of film, and that I think opened about 2012. I was involved. I did the technical spec and the ergonomics, color scheme and things. So I was involved with that. And that was very successful with school groups and lots of nice things. And I think there's things happening in America at the moment, which means that there will be more display of pre-cinema items in America.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but there's movement. And it changes depending on who curators are, their donations to the museums. But the answer is there is still a lot of material within private collections, and sometimes that's accessible and sometimes not. And the same goes for museums. I mean, I've learned so much. The problem mostly with museums is that the things, if they're on display, they're in glass cabinets. And you can only learn so much from a mechanism, for instance, especially when it's displayed with the wooden case on top, so you can't actually see any of the mechanism, which happens to,
like the peep shows, for example.
So whereas if it's a collector, they're quite happy for you to play with it carefully, and you can learn so much more. So there's definitely a place for private collections, no question. But it does mean that you have to obviously approach a collector, build up a relationship with them. And as you know, I'm happy people come to me. I don't have a proper collection, but I've got odd bits and pieces that are interesting. And people come to my studio. And I'm very happy to show them anything if I've got something I think they might be interested in. And I think that's true of most collectors. They do like to show their objects, generally,
Okay. And if you would recommend the best museums or places to see press cinema objects, what's your the most you liked it?
Turin. Bearing in mind some of these I haven't been to for a very long time, but from what I remember, I've been to them all, but from what I remember, certainly the new arrangement of the museum in Paris, the Cinémathèque Museum, that's going to be I think very special. It's always special. They have a particular talent for the quality of display, and in every respect, and it's beautifully arranged, beautifully lit, beautifully researched. And it's not a huge museum, but it doesn't need to be. And it integrates pre-cinema with early film in a very intelligent way. So certainly that one, check out when it's open. I understood it was going to reopen this January, so it might be open, but depends on COVID, I don't know. And if you happen to be in the Middle East, in Dubai, check out the, I'm not sure the current name of it, it changed names, but it's a little moving image museum. There, private, you have to book, but that's worth going to. Every country has some exhibit somewhere, and they change. And there's Italy, Turin,
Padua.
Yeah, wonderful museum, Laura Zotti's museum. Beautifully displayed. I've not been there for many years, but I know the quality of the work that they always put into their exhibitions.
Okay.
Last time I went to Turin, I mean, they've been many years now in this amazing building, old building, and it's an unusual museum. So some museums display the objects very simply, and that can work very well. Others want to integrate them with displays of perhaps, more challenging displays, modern interpretations, and that can also work well, of course. So I think the thing to do is if you think, well, I might want to travel and look at these places, you need to get up-to-date research. So do a Google search on museum, pre-cinema, early film, and get a feeling for where these museums are. And then most of them have good websites. You can check them out. Most of them will have videos on YouTube that visitors have made, which is always a good way to look at what's happening in the museum, to see the latest videos on YouTube. People walk around and you can see. And I'm going to get into trouble for missing the names of lots of museums I've been to in the last 20 years. but the best way is to get more up-to-date information by doing that kind of research. Just search around on the net, and also start to, when you contact someone in a museum, ask them where else you should go. So someone who's currently working in a museum situation, they will know the latest exhibitions. And a lot of exhibitions have new books published in association with them. So again, check on your favorite book online or bookshop and just see what's coming out book-wise, because that will sometimes give you a clue to new exhibitions, because obviously some of them are temporary. Some of the most amazing exhibitions of pre-cinema equipment, Werner Nekesch's exhibitions that he had all over Europe, and I think in America maybe, they were extraordinary, and they were just there for a period and then gone. And all you have is the book. So do watch out for the temporary exhibitions in particular.
That's great. Okay. I saw that Martin Gilbert gives us hello. So
hello, Martin. Good to see you. Martin's maybe I'll get into trouble for saying this, the premier magic lanternist. No, sorry, it's shared between Martin and Jeremy. But he's a wonderful magic lanternist and collector, and good friend.
Yes, thank you, Martin, for watching us. So I would like to change our page and start to talk more about you. We have here Stephen Herbert, old but still working website, no?
Just.
And that was a very important place of information from me, and on my own research and in my bridge. That's where I knew about your work. And I would like to talk, first of all, about the project box, the projection box project, which is not working anymore, but it used to be an editor with your wife, Mo.
Yeah, with my partner, Mo. Well, Mo was the brains of the business, which is why we managed to keep going for quite a few years. And I mean, I'm absolutely, that's the case. I wouldn't have been able to do it. She has the business sense to keep us afloat. Also, just a little tip for someone who's publishing books: be careful about making a situation where you have to go to the post office with parcels every day of your life for 10 years. It's not recommended. And Mo did that for 10 years. Don't do this. Don't do this. This is not
every day for 10 years.
yeah. Don't do this. So, sorry, yeah.
No, sorry. How many books did you publish?
We lost track because some of them were just pamphlets. They were quite small, but I think still some of those were quite important. And then we got into books, and they included The Titanic and Silent Cinema by Stephen Bottomore, which was a book about every aspect of film people who were on the Titanic and films about the Titanic. The relationship between the ship and its sinking and silent cinema. Fascinating book. The Muybridge book that we published in association with Kingston Museum, Edward Muybridge,
The Kingston Bequest. I have here. I will show you. Just 1 second.
Okay. That's it. So it's a landscape format book, and it was the first time that Muybridge's colour discs had been reproduced in colour. In fact, it was 80% of his picture discs had never been reproduced really in any single volume. So it was the documentation, and also a listing of his many hundreds of lantern slides. Yeah, so you get some idea. So if you're interested in Muybridge's lectures and his screen presentations and his Zoopraxiscope, there's more detail there than in any other publication, by far. That was. We were so happy. We were really privileged to work with Kingston Museum on that book, and it was a very quickly produced book because it was for a celebration of commemoration of Muybridge's death 100 years later. So yeah, thank you for showing that. So that was another book we did. We did Phantasmagoria by Mervyn Hurd, which was about the history of the magic lantern, the secret life of the magic lantern.
I have here as well. Please keep walking. I will take it.
Okay. Shall I keep talking? Mervyn, dear friend who passed away a few years ago, sadly, and much missed. And it was actually his, he worked on his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, and turned it into this book. And it's quite a chunky book, and we were so pleased to be able to publish that.
Yes, amazing.
And Mervyn was a showman. He was a researcher, historian, and he's on the back of the book in one of his costumes. You can see him there, dressed up, because he had a wonderful sense of humour and was a great professional theatrical showman, and was a lanternist for many, many years. And I suppose when he was at the top of what he was doing, he was the world's #1, I think, lanternist. And travelled all over the world giving shows. So we were pleased to do that. And again, I'll get into I published, we published a couple of my own books. Theodore Brown's Magic Pictures, which was about an inventor who was also associated with the early British film industry. He was a cartoonist, toy maker, and it was one of those interdisciplinary people who worked in different media. And a book about Wordsworth Donisthorpe, who tried to invent the movies, and why he didn't manage to succeed. So, and there were others. We very much enjoyed the books, and we also published CD-ROMs of out of print old books, and one new publication which was about Burt Akers, who was England's first filmmaker, and that was The Family Story. And we published it as a CD-ROM, and that was in about those kind of 2005, that sort of period when we were publishing CD-ROMs. Yeah,
that's great. Oh, I suppose that the history of press cinema, which is 3 volumes, history of press cinema. Yeah. Sorry, history. What's the name of the other volumes, please?
That's a 3-volume set, A History of Pre-Cinema, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Then there was another 3-volume set called A History of Early Film, and there was another 3-volume set called A History of Early Television. Yes. And I edited the 3 sets, and they are basically, each one is a small essay, a short essay by me, and then collected materials. So it's facsimile materials from English language, periodicals, books, things that were not too easily available in the new universities in particular that were becoming established in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. They couldn't get the original books too easily. And this was published ridiculously expensive, but served a purpose before. You see, this first one, History of Pre-Cinema, was the year 2000.
2000.
And so it's more than 20 years ago. And although the web was well established, there was not the material, the PDF downloads and all that really wasn't there. Yes, so it was a stopgap. It was a stopgap between the libraries who couldn't get the old books and wouldn't necessarily be able to find the articles within old journals. I spent weeks at the British Library and the Science Museum Library just randomly trawling old journals for articles that no one else had found, which I did find. And also, of course, from references from other books, going back to those articles and copying them. So it was a job. It was something that, I got a little bit of money to do, and I needed the money. I didn't have a full-time job. But I also, of course, it was very fascinating for me to find new things and to be able to do that work. Yeah, and that was published by Routledge. Those 3 sets were published by Routledge over a period of a few years at the early part of the century. Yeah.
That's great. Yes. 9 volumes about, I have here a card from your signature, best wishes. By accident was inside Phantasmagoria when you sent me, when you went to post a book for me. And so I would like to talk a little bit about the Wheel of Life. It's a website that you used to work with another person, no?
No, the Wheel of Life was mine.
Yeah. Okay.
Except that Martin Gilbert, well, I say except a big exception. It was my idea and I produced the website, but Martin Gilbert in particular provided a very large number of the images. In fact, I really couldn't have done it without those images from his private collection. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, I needed that input from Martin. The research was mostly mine, and I did a lot of research on the writing, of course. It's basically the story of those optical toys in some detail, and we tried to make it as accurate as possible. And I spent a lot of time trying to get the facts right and trying to find images that people would find interesting. So it's a repository of information, really, about those optical toys.
Yes, and there we have the chapter from Phenical Scope, Praxinoscope, Viviscope, and all of them zoetropes, and all of them fully of images and animations. It's a very, very beautiful done and construct this website.
Except the usual problem which happens with these things, excuse me, is after a year or two, you've got other enthusiasms. And so, you think, I'm going to get back to it. I'm going to fill in those gaps. So, because people have offered me things to go on there that need to be there. And it's just, I've moved on, really. I've kind of told the story. I've put a lot of material there. And I think it's a good place to start if you're interested. I mean, the research, this guy, Mr. William Lincoln, he invented the zoetrope when he was 15.
Really?
Yeah, well, he invented the toy that was, when he named it the zoetrope, and he arranged for it to be patented and produced. The basic idea had come from 30 years earlier, but William Lincoln, and I thought there must be, I wonder if there's a biography, because he didn't become an inventor. He did this when he was at school, And then I found a book about the family, just a little family history, and there was his picture. So there's that kind of research that I love to do. And some of these images, they're either from Martin Gilbert or Lester Smith. So I couldn't have done the website without those collectors. My own collection's very, very tiny. And other people, who Dick Balzer, who sadly is no longer with us, he gave me permission to use his images. And I was pleased with how far I managed to get before it became a bit too much. The website that you might be referring to with someone else, that was the Who's Who of Victorian Cinema.
Yeah, sorry about
it. That was the one that, I mean, all these websites need lots of people to make them work. But that particular website was originally a book. Luke McKernan, who was then working for the BFI in the 90s, this is the mid-90s, the director of the BFI, British Film Institute, said to us, Martin, Another 50 already. Okay, Martin, thank you. 50 images. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, we must get down to doing some of that. Okay. 95, the director of the BFI said to Luke and myself, can we publish a book about the beginnings of the movies for the centenary, which was about a year to go, and we had to get the thing together in less than a year to give the publishing department time to do it. So we had a lot of, I think it might have been as many as more than 20 contributors, I don't know, 30 contributors to the book of the Who's Who. And it was published in 96. And then years later, we turned it into a website, Who's Who Victorian Cinema. And Luke has taken the brunt of the work. He's been uploading changes, updates, new material for years and years. I've been doing some research, feeding him material. If it's Who's Who, so if you put it's Who apostrophe.
Okay.
Who
Mr. Pepper, could you please try to find out
of Victorian cinema?
Victorian.
If you're Victorian cinema.
Victorian.
Oh, the second one down. Yeah. You missed it.
Sorry.
That's it. Okay.
It's a kind of biography focus, no?
Almost 300 biographies, mini biographies of people who were involved in film before Queen Victoria died. And they're not all, it's not older people, it's just people who we thought had interesting stories and were quite deeply involved in film. They weren't all filmmakers, they were people who acted in films, they were film directors, they were producers, people who wrote about film if they wrote in the very early years and interesting material. So they're the people. And the website was active. In other words, we were adding material, at least in theory, until January of this year, last month. And
really?
In January we froze it, so it's frozen.
So, oh, really?
Yep. So it will stay there as long as we can keep it there. It's archived as well, but we are no longer able to find the time. You have to move on, and we did that for so many years. And it was wonderful because we would get emails from families, descendants of these people, asking us questions, but also giving us information, photographs. So it was very exciting and right up until the end, really. But it's not the end in the sense that those biographies are there. They will be superseded by new information, and it's up to someone else to take that over. But I was looking at the book the other day, just pulled it off the shelf. I've never opened the book, but why would we? It's online. And there's been so much work done by all the contributors, so many contributors who put that together in just a few, I think 6 months we put that together originally. And then so many contributors since have provided material. So it was a wonderful experience. And it's kind of something we've compartmentalized now and moved on from.
That's really, really amazing. Can I take advantage that I'm talking with you right now and ask you a particular question with a particular image, this Phenical Scope image? This image is also published in my own book as being the Phenical Scope. But I thought that the original Phenical Scope wasn't with these two shutters disc. It was just one card box with, and then you had to see through a mirror.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there were different arrangements. Some versions had slots within the picture disc, and you viewed it with a single stick, like a handle, and you looked through the mirror, at the pictures. Another version had, so the disc without the slots, and I can't remember all the details of this Phenical Scopes. I'm really fascinated by them, but I don't have all the history in my head. But certainly these variations and there were other variations, the Foralit and various. Obviously, people sort of slightly reinvented the format over the years, and I can't help you too much on that, although we can source that illustration properly. But the number of slots varies hugely, from 5 to probably at least a dozen, and obviously that depends on the nature of the movement. There is so many variations, and the original ones by Stampfer, who was working at the same time as Plateau, Stampfer in Austria. They had, I think, little round holes. Some had square holes. Some had, and if you make the slot too wide, the image is too blurred. So it's a trade-off between the brightness of the image and the sharpness of the focus. All of those things, which are very interesting. In terms of the history of how the double phenakistoscope arrangement, I'd have to go back to the books and look. I don't remember exactly.
Yes, I was trying to find here the stroboscope. Yeah. They are together here in the website.
Yeah.
They here there is Dr. Perry's arrangement. It's
for two people to view it simultaneously.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
That's really amazing. Really, okay. We are not going to go in further on that because people which are watching, maybe they will be boring about that. Okay. So I would like to come back and talk about from another project that you going further. It's really amazing how you studied and keep study for years and years without being a professional in a traditional
amateur. I'm an amateur, yeah.
Amateur. Yeah. You remember that I told you that the translation from amateur in Portuguese is amador, and love is amor.
Amor from the Latin, amor.
Yes,
sure. And that's why I'm very proud to say I'm an amateur in the best sense. I hope it's in the best sense, because we tend to use it as a derogatory term, don't we? Amateurish, it's not very good. But I am an amateur, and I've never been a professional researcher. Although I've researched in association with universities and other institutions, but I'm independent. Yeah.
Yes, that's why you achieve it with. You could also prepare in an independent way and start studying in the way you want, not in
I want. Yeah, which is selfish, and I'm a bit of a control freak. When we were publishing our books, I designed every page. I did. Not that I don't trust designers, but when I'm looking at an image, I wanted to say that needs to be big, so we can see this detail. And it may be only a subject specialist can realize that. Yeah. So I am a control freak, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Oh, Stephen. Well, I would like to talk about the complete Muybridge, and of course, it's a wonderful experience from everyone who wants to know about that. It was a kind of reference from me in writing my own book, Among Birds and Horse, my bridge, my hair, and the press cinema. In the occasion that thank you very much.
Thank you.
And this website for me, it's perfect. I loved this only page format.
No designer on that. No designer, just the database.
Database. Perfect. And every link you go inside that, it's a kind of word that opens. So
it's a rabbit hole, we call it. A rabbit hole. You go down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
Habit hole. Yes. Habit hole. Perfect. So how many years you spent in this
I try not to think about it. The thing is, the title, The Complete Muybridge, is a reference to the complete angler, but it's ironic because, of course, it can never be complete. And I knew that before I started. But the idea was to get as much material in one place, because there were an increasing number of books about Muybridge and increasing number of places where his story was told. And it was starting to become possible to do newspaper searches online. And so initially it was just a chronology. It was a chronology mostly of his lectures, which hadn't been listed. Yeah, so that's what it was. It was just that to start with. And then I quite quickly expanded it. Yeah, so you can go to any year and see.
20 years, you suppose? No.
I tell you what happened with Muybridge.
Please.
I've mentioned 1971 and the Barnes Museum, and so I had a slight grounding. And then in 92, I think, Brian Coe, the world expert on camera technology, I worked with him, lovely guy. And we co-curated an exhibition at the Museum of the Moving Image called Muybridge and the Chrono Photographers. Half the exhibition already existed. It was display boards from Kingston Museum. They had recently closed an exhibition that had been open for years and asked us if we wanted the boards. Would we be interested? And we said yes, because there had been an exhibition that was due to happen had collapsed. The money had disappeared. So we had to put an exhibition together very quickly. So we had half our exhibition space was prepared by Kingston Museum. It was their boards. The other half, we had to try to think of something to go in there. So we expanded to include Murray, Laund, the other, Anschutz, the other chrono photographers, but we were quite limited on the material that we could use. So Brian and I went to Kingston Museum several times. We were photographing objects, we were listing objects, examining the zoopraxiscope in great detail, so that we had an understanding of the subject, a better understanding of the subject. And we were so lucky that it was just a short drive away, really. In the whole world, there it all was, and they had his collection. So we understood the material more. Brian wrote a little book to accompany the exhibition, and it's always, people never believe this, but I can tell you, I think it was like in the middle of a week, we went into the curator's office and we found all the photographs that we could find from our own collections, Brian and I, that were relevant to the subject. And then he spent a day writing. Then he had a special Doctor Who presentation weekend that he was compere. So he had to do Saturday and Sunday doing that. Tuesday night, the book had to go to the printers. So in less than a week, he wrote that little book, and it was laid out and printed for the exhibition. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I've only spotted about 2 mistakes. I was a picture researcher, which meant that we went through our drawers looking for pictures. And I think if you don't understand the circumstances under which a publication is made, it's difficult to actually judge it properly. So we were deeply into Muybridge at that time. Of course, Brian was already very knowledgeable. He'd written the history of movie photography. He was already a specialist in chrono photography. So I was very lucky to be able to learn so much from him in a short period of time. And then my associate, Brian, sadly, he had an accident in 95 and he had a stroke in 96. So he was no longer able to continue. But I continued my association with Kingston Museum, which still exists. So it's been nearly 30 years now. And through successive curators, it's been a real joy for me and a privilege over that time to be involved with exhibitions and conferences and to be involved with the collection. But I did come to a point with the Complete Muybridge when I thought, I've got to stop this now. You have to move on. And the one thing that I should have done, and I didn't do, was a page about his cameras. It's not there.
About his cameras?
Yeah, it's not there. I mean, there are various pages where you see it's not there. I didn't get to it, so it's not the complete Muybridge. One major respect, and it's interesting because most of the emails, inquiries that I get are about his cameras, because of course everything else they can pretty much find out. But the cameras are complicated, and I'm not a camera person. I'm a projector person. So I was in the process of working out the cameras, which was quite difficult, and it didn't get onto the website. Maybe something, it's still live, you know, maybe it's something I could do, but I don't know.
Maybe between B and C here, maybe there will be.
We'll find a space, squeeze in.
Find a space, yes. Yeah, I noticed that there is a gap here above Zoopraxis scope discs. So it's possible to put camera here.
Yeah, we'll move them all along one.
Yeah.
I wrote the HTML myself, so it's not too difficult to just pick everything along. It's good.
And also we have here this chronology, as you mentioned, it's where this project starts. Yeah. And this, I remember it told me once that this chronology was published in a Tachen publication.
Yeah. I'd forgotten that actually, but it was, yeah. And I think it was the long version, because if you can see light, when you see light, that's you know, it's just a short version for people who don't need the. I've edited it down to the highlights, but I think it was pretty sure it was the long version. It was a big book of Muybridge. Yeah. It was the whole of animal locomotion and other material in one book, and a chunky book which I have in my studio. And yeah, that had the chronology in the back. Yeah, and the other thing about it is that because
let me see if it's this one that I have also here. Just. By the way, is this or not?
What's the title of that one? I think that's a different book. No, that's a different book. Who's the editor of that one, or the author?
Let me see. I think this one is Elios from his exhibition in.
Yeah, no, that's a different. Yeah, that's the the Tate Gallery exhibition.
The Gorgonian Gallery in Washington, no?
Yeah, that's a different book.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, what was wonderful at that time, that Gorgonian exhibition came to, or a large amount of it came to England, was to be able to see the landscape photographs of Muybridge. We had access to the animal locomotion plates, but in this country, very few of the stereo views and almost none of the landscape photographs. And there was a bit of controversy at the time about whether he was an agent for a photographer, for Carlton Watkins in that case, I think, or whether he took them himself. And I don't know. I mean, to me, it's more important that they've survived and they're wonderful pictures, and he was associated with them. And yeah, if you Google the other book with the chronology, you'll probably find it.
Okay.
I don't know whether I don't know how up to date this is in terms of books. I'm not sure. It's very old now, I think, that list of books.
That's great. So, like you mentioned already, these websites that we have been talking about, it's your old projects, no?
Yeah, well, they are really,
yeah. So I would like to talk about your most recently project, the Optilog.
Yes.
Which you started in December of last year, no?
Just a few weeks ago, really, yeah.
A few weeks ago.
Yeah.
What is Optilog about?
Okay. First of all, I'll tell you what an Optilog is, or was. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, please.
Because I didn't know until I discovered a few years ago. I came across the name on the web, the Optilog, and reference to a form of optical telegraph. Well, I'd never heard of it. Okay. So I did some research, and it was a proposal for about 3 different types of machine by which you could send what were basically text messages from one hillside to another or whatever. The one that you see here in the center of the Optilog, yeah, that's actually a proposal for a large building that would be built on a hill in Paris.
No.
There will be a proposal, 4 faces facing in 4 directions. That could be in 4 languages, and it will be government information, essentially, mostly, to the people. So if you were going towards the Latin Quarter, it'd be in a particular language. So wherever you are in Paris, you could see the government's latest information.
Wow.
But the extraordinary thing was that there was also personal versions. So if you had, I'm giving away a secret because I'm going to write about this soon, but I'll tell you, just
okay.
you. No one else.
Okay.
If you could have a machine made like a small piano,
yeah,
where the letters, the symbols, which were letters and formed words, could be played like a piano, and they would form in these circles, and you would have a text. And you wheeled this machine up to your window of your country house on a hill with your telescope on top, and then your friend, who happened to have a country house on a hill a mile away, or half a mile away, could wheel up their machine to the window with their telescope, and you could text each other.
Wow.
Now, you might think, oh, this is what they call vaporware. It never happened. Well, it didn't happen, except that the inventor demonstrated one of the machines. And I think almost certainly it would have had to work to some extent, but how do you work out the mechanism between a keyboard and these amazing letter devices that formed a message? We don't know what the mechanism was. So that was the Optilog. And the story of what happened after that in terms of my involvement, finding an original pamphlet about the Optilog, and that's quite a story in itself. So I'll save that for my blog. But that's an Optilog. And you just see, when I wanted to start a blog about optical media, what is optical media? It doesn't mean anything, popular optical media, it's difficult to define, but I think people kind of get the idea. It seemed to me the perfect name. It's a blog, and it's about optics. And I was already researching this thing, so I named the new blog after it. And the intention is not to have any boundaries, but just to do things that are optical, that interest me, optical media that interest me. And I won't have any timelines, except I think it's going to be mostly before the second half of the 20th century, but if something bounces into later years, that's fine. And no backward boundary time-wise, and just things that have interested me over the years and are continuing to interest me.
That's great. Yes, I'm so excited to read the next articles from Optilog. And since the beginning, you email some friends, and thanks for keep me informed about your new project. So I've been in touch with Optilog since in the very beginning.
Yeah.
One of the first readers. Thank you very much for that.
There's a lot to read. I'm sorry its blog has been so long. They won't be that long in the future.
And until now, this experience is focused on the British pioneer Herbert Poe.
Yes.
Nope.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know a little bit about more. Why did you select to work with Herbert Poe?
Well, my late friend John Barnes wrote 5 books about the beginnings of the cinema in England. That was, his work finishes in January 1901. So it's that short period of 5 or so years. And one of the main characters throughout that story is Robert Paul, who was, he designed machines, some of the first film machines, and he started a film studio, and he sold these film machines for many years. Well, it was quite a few years, considering that everything moved very quickly in those days in the film industry. And he made hundreds of films over a period of about 8 years, maybe a little more, 9 years. Yeah. He was in film from making films from 1896 to about 1908, 9. So it's a little bit longer than that, but a huge number of films. And being a technician, my interest initially was in the equipment because it was available. The films were not that easily available to see, but eventually there was a video. And then John's work finished in 1901, whereas Robert Paul stayed in the industry for another 8 or 9 years. So there was a lot more to know. And although other people had written about his activities, there was no consistent work. And then Professor Ian Christie published a book in the very end of 2019, and it gives a much more rounded picture of his work. It's called Robert Paul and the Origins of British Cinema. So it has to pretty much stay within those parameters. But Paul was actually an electrical instrument maker. That was his main business. And what happened is Professor Christie's book includes just enough information about his electrical business, his later life, which involved other types of activities, to fill in those areas briefly, but importantly. And then obviously most of the book is about the films and the film studio, of course. So I felt that I wanted to I was interested in doing a little more work for myself on the equipment and do some more research. I'd already done some over many years, do some more research, and also, and put that somewhere. It wouldn't have been appropriate in a book, really. It was just for the enthusiast who want to know more detail. And then also I sort of proposed a different way of looking at Robert Paul. Maybe my feeling is that he needs to be looked at as more of a film producer, than the creative element behind the films. That's a suggestion. It's not very well received. I don't think most people think of it seriously, but that's a suggestion from me. I think it's important to have another perspective on every subject, rather than the standard perspective. I think if you kind of make some suggestions that are a little bit unexpected, it can help you to focus the subject. So that's what I decided to do. And there was a period when I was ill, as you know, a year ago, seriously ill, and it enabled me to focus on something during that period and get down a body of work. And I decided that would be that was the way to produce it. It's very patchy in terms of looking at Robert Paul. There's no way that it would be a proper book. So it's just aspects and angles that have interested me. And I think might interest other people. And so it just seemed to go on and on and on. And eventually I managed to finish it with part 9 pretty much. It's there. Yeah.
And do you think that what's it's a very stupid question. What's the importance of Robert Paul in British cinema?
It's a very good question.
A kind of the same importance of Lumiere's brothers in France. Can we say that?
Lumiere stopped making films in very early on, pretty much 1900, really, didn't they? So he's got he was in the business much longer. Okay. And I think what was important about Paul, it seems to me, in terms of his filmmaking, the filmmaking of his studios, was that he was a disruptor. in the
Okay.
modern sense. Yeah. And he was very clever in following where he thought the market was going. And he was because he was in charge, it was his business, he was able to change the genre or the type of film he was making when he thought the market was going in a particular direction. Because, you know, the conventional Hollywood didn't exist. This is pre 1910. So the business was changing, and there was still an awful lot of documentary, as we would call it now, film, which of course there isn't in later cinema. So trick films were popular for a while, and then they died away a little. He went with everything that was going when it seemed that that was going to be where the market was. That's what it seems to me, and I think that's amazing. I mean, to be flexible enough to realize and to change quickly into what the people wanted and what his exhibitors wanted, and to be flexible enough to be able to do that. And then I think, as is generally agreed, that by 1909-10, huge amount of extra investment will be needed because films were getting longer, more complex. Studios needed to be more sophisticated. The machinery was changing as well, and he was involved in developing the machinery that would have needed completely changing. So, and he had what he called his main business, which was electrical instrument making. He had that going all the time and expanding all the time. And he did call the film business his sideline. So he decided, I think, you know, he'd been in it long enough, and he decided it was time to move on. And what's interesting to me is he might still have been making a lot of money making films, but he might not have been making as much money as he could have done by putting that investment into his electrical instrument business. Yeah. It doesn't mean he was losing money. I don't know. We don't know enough about his accounts. And it may just be that the electrical instrument business, which was his first love, it's what he did before film, and what he went back to. It just was something that he just felt he needed to pursue. That the film business was being too big. It had outgrown those early pioneers. In the same, you know, if you think Méliès is finished by 1912, 13. Mm-hmm. And when Méliès is in his little toy stall in 1930, in a drafty toy stall in the Paris railway station selling toys, probably 6 days a week, Robert Paul's a multimillionaire. And he did the right thing for him. And I think he's an amazing character. And I just have a slightly different perspective to some other people who've written about him. And I think that's fine. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying I think it's useful to have different perspectives on that.
That's great. That's great. Every student of early cinema has to know that Robert Paul was the constructor of Georges Méliès on camera, no?
Huge thing, yeah, absolutely.
The Theatrograph, is it the Theatrograph or not?
Basically, it had different names, the projector, but it was one of his early projectors. He sold, I think, several to Georges Méliès. And
oh, really?
One of them Méliès built into a case and converted it slightly to make a camera, and it was Méliès' first camera. And what an amazing thing that this British mechanism, because Méliès is, you know, as is well known, he wasn't able to buy a camera from the Lumières. Mm-hmm. And he did manage to make this camera that he used for a short period at the beginning of his filmmaking career. And if you look at Méliès' film of The Card Party, which was almost certainly shot with that camera, it's great. I mean, technically it's fine. So the thing worked as a camera. And what was incredible was that for most of for decades, we thought it was just a story. You know, it was just a story, and we
really,
yeah. And then in, I think, 1994, Lauren Manoni at the Cinematheque found the camera. It was in the collection.
Really,
by the Méliès family in the 1930s, and there it was. And I went over to Paris to see it. You know, it was just an amazing moment. 95. Yeah. And to be able to look at this thing, and it's very clear what it. In fact, I think the Robert Paul name on the base plate has either been filed away or covered over. It's immediately obvious what it is, and it was true, and it was been used subsequently in exhibitions, and it's in. I'm sure it'll be in the current Méliès book that I mentioned, and it's certainly been in other recent books about Méliès from the Cinematheque. So, yeah, that was so. Exciting things happen all the time, and some old stories you have to discard, and some old stories turn out to be true.
That's great. That's great. You have a special participation in BBC. We are going to the end of our interview, no, yeah. Stephen? But I would like just to make 2 or 3 more questions. One of them is to...
thank you, Angelica.
Okay, thank you, Angelica. To talk about your participation, that's the name in Portuguese. I'm making a free translation. That's participation right. In this wonderful BBC documentary about mechanical monsters. And then in this documentary, you make a replica of Herbert Poe's projector, no?
It's not a replica. I knocked together, as we call it, in a model, which sort of represented what he would have done. Yeah. So Perfect. It was done with items that I had to hand in my workshop to give an idea to the general public. So it's not a replica, but it's a model of something like he would have made.
Yes, of course. It's not a replica. It's stupid.
No. It's an interesting. I mean, it's. I think a general. Generally you say yes, replica, but being specific, it's a model.
Yeah. And then, so you collect some mechanicals and also the Cruz de Malta, which is this one that we are watching it.
Cross, and this one's got 5 arms. Robert Paul's had 7. It was the nearest I could get, but it enables you to see the mechanism of those early machines. And how basically simple and basic it was. But of course, it seems basic to us. They had to invent it and make it work. And that took a few months. And I put this together because the program just wanted something that looked the part that they could put in the corner of the studio. And I said, no, I don't do film props, but I'll make something that works. And that's an original period lamp house. It's got an original arc lamp in it. And then the mechanism is actually a German mechanism from a toy machine, but it's very, very similar to those early mechanisms. And then that's actually a Robert Paul electrical item, a real one from the period. So I put together, and there's a big wheel that's cranked, which is what he used. I found one of those, and that was the idea, was to give an idea of what he would have been doing in his workshop. When he met H.G. Wells and talked about the idea of making a machine that could give this impression, together with magic lantern slides, of a time machine journey. And
that's great history of H.G. Wells.
Yeah, it's a great story that Professor Christie goes into in great detail, and what an amazing story that he outlines in his book.
That's great. Yeah.
You can see there sprocket, which, just introducing to the public the idea that you have to have this sprocket that engages with the teeth. One of the things that I've discovered in the last 20 years is that because younger people have been brought up on digital, they quite often absolutely know it. You say to them, well, he had a negative. They don't know what that is. They don't know what a negative is. They've never handled a negative.
Yeah.
So when you're talking, you have to show the item, I think, to make it.
Yes. And the result, of course, it's quite flickering, but it works. No?
It was flickery. His first machines, he said himself, they were very flickery. And this is an old Edison kinetoscope. Well, it's a modern print of an Edison kinetoscope film called Breakdown Dance. And it's a piece of scrap film I happen to have. And it indicates that he was nearly there. He'd nearly achieved it. It wasn't quite enough to show the public, but with a little more refinement, he was going to be able to do this.
Yeah. just one gossipy comment. What's the name of this professor from Cambridge? Professor here, sorry.
Simon Schaffer.
Sorry,
Simon Schaffer.
Simon Schaffer. Yes,
Yep.
I thought in the edition when you project it, he was like quite amazing. Wow, that's wonderful. And you in opposite, it was a kind of, that's a kind of flickering and relativization. And oh, that's not so frustrating. That's wonderful. Even it's flickering. And look here.
Because I put myself in the position of Robert Paul, which is that's
exactly. That's only a gossipy.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's fun though. It's fun. Yeah,
it's fun. It's fun. So that's really great documentary. I recommend from everyone who is watching us. So this is Stephen Herbert. We are been talking for a long time, but before leaving here, I would like to make a question that is in common from everyone who is studying the archaeology of moving image, is the use of the word and the term pre-cinema, the term that I use here and Flicker and Flow conversation. Yeah. What do you think about this issue?
We all use it, and I started to become a little uncomfortable with it in the late 90s or the mid 90s because it foregrounds cinema. Now, if we imagine that cinema hadn't been invented in, say, 1895, all of those other things would still exist, yeah? So they would still need a term that covered them, and it obviously couldn't be cinema. And in a sense, what that does, and I'm just saying what everyone in the field now realizes, this is not my thoughts, this is what I've learned from other people, is that each of those media, whether it be the panorama, the Zoetrope, Magic Lantern, they're their own field. They don't need to be related to in terms of cinema particularly. It's interesting if you do, and you can learn things from that, but they're bigger than that. Mm-hmm. So there is a tendency when we say pre-cinema to imagine that somehow they're the primitive beginnings of this important thing that was cinema. Mm. And I was actually giving a lecture in Cologne in 1995. And I was halfway through the lecture. It was my usual lecture. It was called From Diorama to IMAX. It's like 200 years of big screen. And I was making these analogies and these references to cinema. And about halfway through the lecture, I suddenly thought, this is all nonsense. This lecture I've been giving for years, I thought, this is all nonsense. There was a kind of crisis of confidence, and I realized this is not good enough. And after that, when I was asked to do that reproduction facsimile series, History of Pre-Cinema, they said there's two things. We don't mind what's in it, you choose what's in it, but it's got to be called History of Pre-Cinema. And it's because they had looked into they were smarter and more advanced than I was in thinking about, well, what else would it be? And they couldn't think of an answer. They couldn't come up with a sensible title, whereas the term pre-cinema was starting to be known. It was certainly known in the field. People who were working in those fields would know. So they thought, no, it's got to be that. And that was like, it was a commission and I did what I was told. So, and anyway, I couldn't think of a good alternative. And I've never been able to think of one. And other academics in the field have come up with some good ideas, but they tend to be not too snappy, They're good definitions, but they're quite hard to use. Yeah. To my knowledge, I mean, I don't keep up with all of these things. But
you don't?
No, not really. Not as much as I should. And so maybe there is another brief term out there that we should be using instead now. And if so, I mean, archaeology of the media or archaeology of optical media or visual media is a great term because that phrase is great because it does, I think, indicate that you're digging up things. There's still lots of digging to do and trying to understand what it is we're finding. And I think that's still the case. So I think from that point of view, that's a great phrase. But pre-cinema is the one that, and now people kind of understand it. I think in a wider field, maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know anyone who doesn't know about pre-cinema. It's always difficult, isn't it, to say, not really, not to. I don't know if I talk to my next door neighbour and I mentioned the word, would they have the slightest idea what I'm talking about? I don't know, but it's something we live with.
Yes, for me, there is 2 points. One that you mentioned, press cinema. It's a more popular word, and for me, like an independent researcher as well. Okay, so the researchers in academic has the obligation to find out a better name, and they find out, but they are not so good for hearing this name. And the other, which is a more complex thought about it, is for me, which I'm in the beginning of this study, I'm not afraid of using the term cinema, because cinema, not for my own generation, because when I studied cinema at University of São Paulo, there was only 35mm camera, etc. But today, I think that the digital era, we are not afraid about anymore what does cinema means.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a kind of use the term press cinema. It's like a reference. There is not necessary the teleological meaning on it. It's just a reference. Something very important happened in the 1895. In the same way that in 2007, Steve Jobs forget the word, the iPhone. So it's a kind of landmark. For me, it would be easy to say the audio communication pre-iPhone. It doesn't mean that the communication that becomes before iPhone was a teleological meaning. I really understand, not understanding anymore in the last month.
That's a good perspective, and I think that that crisis of confidence I was saying happened to me now more than 25 years ago, and the situation changes, and I think that perspective that you have is totally valid, and it's reasonable, and also unless we have the option of another reasonable alternative that is going to be understood, then in a sense it's academic as to whether we can use it or not, because we don't have an alternative. But I think what you're making is a good point as well, which is you can make a case to say it's a landmark that we use. I just think at some point you have to kind of explain to those who are interested and want to know, but that doesn't mean that they're only there to reference the beginnings of cinema or the medium of cinema. That has to be explained at some point. It's interesting that Olive Cook's book from 1962 or something was called Movement in Two Dimensions. And she couldn't work out a category either. I had lunch with Olive. I was very honoured to have lunch with Olive Cook many years ago, and we discussed her book because it was part of the set that Routledge were about to reproduce, and we had to get permission, and she was very amenable. But we talked a little about those things, and one of the terms that was in use in those days was precursors of cinema. So it was a longer term, precursors, but it's quite awkward. And you can see how that became contracted to pre-cinema. And I think that we're going to live with that now. And as you say, as we're well into the digital age, our perspective on the use of that phrase is likely to, is changed, really.
Yeah, I think it's changed. And in my opinion, there are so similar between the pre-cinema age and the post cinema
Oh,
age in digital era, because like in the same way that we have these optical devices, all of most of them are inside of the applications
right.
in the mobile phone.
Well,
So we have
Edward Muybridge has been called the father of the animated GIF.
yeah.
And which absolutely, which for quite a few years now, and that says it all, doesn't it? Because really, what he was doing with his Praxiscope, that was an animated GIF, but without a computer or an iPhone.
Yeah.
So that relationship between those pre-cinema devices and post-cinema, if you like, digital world, is hugely important. Yeah.
Yes. That's really great. Stephen, I am very glad to talk with you again. And I love the interview. I hope you like it as well.
But it was fun. It's always fun for me to talk about these things. I don't know whether. Thank you both. Okay, Martin. Thank you, Martin. It's great that you stayed the course anyway, right through to the end, because it's been an hour and a half. Anyway, I've enjoyed this, Ramo. It's always great to talk with you, and we do have very fond memories of your visit some years ago. And we hope we'll see you again, you know, without this screen in between us at some point in the future. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to the forthcoming interviews with your guests.
Okay, yes, I would like to promote the Flicker and Flow and take the idea of that Stephen bring here next week on 3rd of February. We are I will be talking with a friend of Stephen, Marta Brown, which is a famous biography of Etienne Julie Marais, and she I think that will be a very good conversation as well. So I would just ask you to maintain in this room. I will put the video, the final video, and then we come back in private just to say goodbye to you, Stephen.
Okay, that's
Okay.
good.
And
Okay.
and I would like to thank everybody who is watching Flicker and Flow, and thank the university, the Pontifícia Universidade Católica, Professor Marcos Bastos, Gabriela Dvoretsky, who is helping me with translation, Paulo Itaboraí, who is in the background here. And so I would like to say bye-bye to everybody and see you next week.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for staying.